Welcome to America in the 1920s, a changing political culture, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students. Before we begin our exploration of America in the 1920s, let's briefly review the time period that came directly before it. The Progressive Era, which lasted from 1890 to 1920, was a time of social activism. Progressives believed that America was in the midst of a serious crisis due to the problems created by industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and the unequal distribution of wealth and power. Progressives were reformers who believed that society's complex social problems could be solved through the direct action of governments, churches, experts, and volunteers. Some reformers directed their attention to attacking the problems of the slums and cleaning up cities, while others focused on the workplace, eliminating child labor, decreasing the length of the workday, and calling for factory inspections. Some organizations advocated for women's suffrage, in other words, women's right to vote, while other groups wanted to see governments create, expand, or improve public services like schools, roads, and conservation of the environment. But one of the most popular causes of progressives was that of prohibiting the sale of alcohol. These reformers worked as part of the temperance movement, a movement that actually began in the early 1800s. They believed that many of society's ills resulted from alcohol abuse, and that by eliminating alcohol, those social problems could be fixed. They called drinking America's national curse. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, fought for prohibition, and the many women who eagerly joined its ranks often viewed alcohol as the destroyer of marriages and families. The Anti-Saloon League also worked to push the issue of prohibition into the forefront of state and local elections, and in 1913 the League endorsed a prohibition amendment to the U.S. Constitution. When World War I began in 1914, the Anti-Saloon League used wartime hostility towards German Americans to further its cause for prohibition. At the time, the majority of breweries in the United States were owned by German immigrants. In a political cartoon like this one, a parade of marching kegs and beer bottles with stereotypical German faces carry placards that show all of the social ills progressives associated with alcohol. With use of the word Hun, an anti-German slur, the cartoon associates German enemies overseas with German breweries in the U.S., whose sale and distribution of alcohol was equated with ruining American society. Cartoons like these during World War I made it patriotic to support prohibition. Did you notice the placard that said, "We waste grain"? Advocates of prohibition also made the argument that using grain to make alcohol, rather than using the grain to make food for American troops who entered the war in 1917, was downright unpatriotic. Political cartoons like this one insinuated that if the American public was to truly support its troops sacrificing their lives abroad, they would back the soldiers by voting yes for prohibition. On January 16, 1920, the work of the temperance movement throughout the Progressive Era finally bore fruit when the 18th Amendment, 1 year after being ratified, went into effect and prohibition began. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. However, it did not make it illegal to drink. Because the 18th Amendment itself included neither provisions for enforcing the law nor penalties for violating the law, Congress also passed the Volstead Act to carry out the intent of the 18th Amendment. Unfortunately, there were so many loopholes that failure was virtually guaranteed. Individuals and organizations were allowed to keep any liquor owned before the law went into effect, and many had stocked up well in advance. It was rumored that the Yale Club in Manhattan even stored up enough liquor to last the 13 years that prohibition would end up being enforced. Farmers were also allowed to preserve their fruits through fermenting them, which resulted in barns across the country stockpiled with hard cider and homemade wines. One of the biggest loopholes of the Volstead Act was that alcohol could still be prescribed medicinally by physicians. A person, even one who was not sick, could acquire a prescription from a willing doctor, take it to a local pharmacy, and go home with a pint of liquor every 10 days. During Prohibition, the rate of sales for medicinal alcohol went up by 400%. Another loophole was the use of sacramental wine for religious purposes. As one example, followers of Judaism use sacramental wine for the Sabbath service and other religious services. Under the rules of the Volstead Act, they were entitled to 10 gallons per adult per year. However, there was no official way to determine who was a rabbi, and as a result, cities saw a large increase in their number of self-professed rabbis trying to exploit this loophole to get a license to distribute wine. Another failure of prohibition was that it ended up being bad for the economy. Prior to prohibition, the federal government made money off alcohol through the taxes associated with alcohol sales. During Prohibition, however, the federal government lost a staggering amount of income when the sale of alcohol was outlawed, and thus tax revenues could no longer be acquired from alcohol sales. In addition, breweries, distilleries, and saloons also shut down, and restaurants lost money from the absence of alcohol sales. Further, as the federal government was losing income from the sale of alcohol, it also spent millions of dollars trying to enforce prohibition. Prohibition has often been called the noble experiment, but the experiment ultimately proved to be a failure. Throughout the Progressive Era, the temperance movement hoped a prohibition law would lower crime rates, but instead, banning alcohol led to increases in crime because the demand for alcohol didn't suddenly disappear with the passage of the 18th Amendment. Instead, it motivated citizens to use crafty and illegal ways to satisfy their desire for alcohol. Enforcing prohibition proved to be extremely difficult. The illegal production and distribution of liquor, often known as bootlegging, became rampant. In Washington, D.C., the largest bootlegger reported that a majority of both houses of Congress were regular customers of his product. The federal government never supplied enough funding to enforce the law, appropriating $5 million to employ just 1,500 agents across the entire country. As depicted in this political cartoon, not even the combined forces of city, state, and federal officers could keep up with or effectively stop the bootlegging industry. There just wasn't the means to enforce every border, lake, river, and road that could be used to illegally transport alcohol. In addition, law enforcement agents were up against criminal gangs that created multi-million-dollar operations to smuggle alcohol into the U.S. to supply illegal bars called speakeasies. Due to the demand for alcohol, speakeasies spread quickly across towns and cities. New York City alone was rumored to have 30,000 speakeasies by the end of Prohibition. In December 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition and the Volstead Act, bringing the noble experiment to an end after 13 years. Former supporters of Prohibition, like John D. Rockefeller Jr., openly admitted its failure. If you watched the Prohibition video, you heard the name of one of the most notorious Prohibition-era gangsters, Scarface Al Capone. Capone grew up in New York City, dropped out of school in the 6th grade, and performed odd jobs to earn money, like clerking in a candy store and setting up pins in a bowling alley. Eventually, he became part of the 5 Points gang in Manhattan. While working as a bouncer and bartender at the Harvard Inn, he received his infamous facial scars and the resulting name Scarface after insulting a patron and being attacked by her brother. Capone was connected to 2 murders in New York City before he reached the age of 20, but he was never tried in court, and he left for Chicago in 1920. During the 1920s, Chicago had 2 major rival gangs, the North Side and South Side gangs. Capone joined up with the South Side, also known as the Chicago Outfit. It didn't take long for Capone to rise through the ranks. When Capone's men killed the leader of the North Side gang, Dion O'Banion, in 1924, a lasting feud began between Capone and one of O'Banion's men, George "Bugs" Moran. Moran attempted to kill Capone on at least 2 occasions, and Capone purchased a custom-upholstered, armor-plated, bulletproof Cadillac limousine for protection and surrounded himself with a platoon of bodyguards. Bootlegging during Prohibition supplied gangs with enormous income. Well-organized crime syndicates worked like giant corporations by controlling the entire stream of liquor's production, pricing, and distribution. By 1927, Capone's Chicago-based bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling empire brought him an annual income of $60 million. Bugs Moran continued his attacks on Capone, burning down Capone's nightclubs and hijacking his liquor supplies. The feud came to a head on Valentine's Day, 1929, when 7 members or associates of Moran's gang were gunned down at their headquarters by men posing as police. Moran was across the street when the men dressed as police arrived, and when seeing them, he fled the scene. The police imposters lined Moran's men against the wall and used 2 shotguns and 2 Thompson machine guns to fire 150 bullets into the victims. Although sales of the Tommy gun were meant only for those on the side of law and order, these guns often ended up in the hands of gangsters who did a great deal of damage with them throughout the Prohibition era. What's now known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was generally attributed to the work of the Capone mob, but no one was ever convicted of the killings. Even though Moran lived, Capone became the undisputed crime boss of Chicago, and the media coverage of the massacre caused the public to put pressure on authorities to stem mob violence. Now that we've explored the failures of Prohibition and the rise of gangsters like Al Capone, let's look at other aspects of the political culture that were changing American society in the 1920s. One of the most famous symbols of the Roaring Twenties is that of the flapper. Flappers adopted new fashions that began to reflect a rebellion against prudishness, traditional morality and values, and involved a loosening of inhibitions. The new woman of the 1920s was supposedly independent, bright-eyed, and alert, as well as eager to gain new freedoms. Flappers discarded the constricting fashions of previous generations that included uncomfortable corsets, confining petticoats, and floor-length dresses. In 1919, women's skirts were typically 6 inches above the ground, and by 1927, the popular length was at the knee. Flappers donned controversial short bobbed hair, sheer stockings, and common accessories that included jazz dancing, smoking, drinking, and wearing long necklaces and makeup, complete with bold lipstick. Traditionalists were shocked at this new model of feminism and viewed their behavior as outrageous and a sign of a degenerating society. Some reacted in extreme ways, like the state of Utah considering imprisoning women who wore skirts more than 3 inches above the ankle, and the state of Virginia introduced a bill that would make it a criminal offense for a woman to wear a gown that displayed more than 3 inches of throat. The state of Ohio even considered punishing retailers that sold garments that unduly displays or accentuates the female figure. It should be noted that the vast majority of women in this era were not actual flappers, although many young women did adopt the fashionable flapper wardrobe. But the role of women was changing. More middle-class women than ever before began attending college, and many women who had joined the workforce to help the war effort during World War I wanted to find ways to continue working outside the home. Millions of women went to work in white-collar jobs that included office work as typists and as sales clerks in department stores. Women also gained an unprecedented new freedom. With the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, women were finally given the right to vote. 9.5 million women were eligible to vote in the 1920 presidential election. Throughout the 1920s, flappers often attracted huge publicity by their fame as movie stars, cultural celebrities, jazz musicians, artists, and writers. One famous flapper, Zelda Fitzgerald, was dubbed by her husband, author F. Scott Fitzgerald, as the first American flapper. Zelda and her husband were the golden couple of the jazz age, a label F. Scott created to describe the spirit of rebellion and spontaneity rising up among young Americans in the 1920s. Zelda sought after all things modern and unconventional, and she was well known for her wild ways, including riding on top of taxicabs and splashing about in hotel fountains. Zelda was a huge influence on her husband's writing, often providing inspiration and material for his short stories and novels. Zelda, though, was an artist in her own right. She wrote 11 short stories, 12 articles, and 1 novel during her lifetime. She was also a painter. Zelda's celebrity status allowed her to frequently contribute her opinions to the media on modern love, marriage, and child-rearing. Another famous flapper was actress Clara Bow. The red-haired actress from Brooklyn, New York, became a star through her hit film The Plastic Age, released in 1925, about the life of a flirtatious flapper. Promotional campaigns for her 1927 film, It, soon earned her the title of It Girl. Bow, known for her fun and affable personality, was glamorized in magazines, and she became a style icon as women across the country began to take up her look. In 1928, she became the highest-paid movie star, earning $35,000 a week. Bessie Smith was also a famous flapper and a blues singer. In 1923, she signed a contract with Columbia Records, and recorded her first record, Downhearted Blues. Her title track, also called Downhearted Blues, was wildly popular and sold an estimated 800,000 copies. Through her rich, powerful voice, she became a successful recording artist who even collaborated a number of times with legendary jazz artist Louis Armstrong. She also toured extensively. Through her song lyrics, she often expressed the frustrations and hopes of Black Americans of her generation. It didn't take long for her to be awarded with the title Empress of the Blues. In the 1920s, several cultural movements received national attention, and one of those movements was Black nationalism. Black nationalism encouraged Black racial pride, fostered Black cultural expression, and endorsed Black separatism. In other words, racial separation rather than racial integration. The leading spokesman for this movement was Marcus Garvey, and his ideas and work are sometimes referred to as Garveyism. Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica. He started the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, in Jamaica and relocated its headquarters to Harlem, New York in 1916. It didn't take him long to enlist 500,000 members in the UNIA, and soon it became the largest Black political organization in the country. Garvey called for African Americans to liberate themselves from the surrounding white culture. He championed racial solidarity and what later came to be called Black Power. He endorsed social and political separation between blacks and whites by helping to form Black community cultural centers, Black businesses, and Black newspapers. He also declared that the only lasting hope for blacks living in the United States was to flee America and build their own republic in Africa. In 1919, he began the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation and envisioned using it to transport American blacks to Africa and also to transport manufactured goods, raw material, and produce among black businesses in North America, the Caribbean, and Africa. Not everyone agreed with Garvey's vision for African Americans, and some black leaders were even outraged by it. Although Garvey and civil rights activist w.e.b. Du Bois both advocated for Pan-Africanism, or the belief that all people of African descent had common interests and should work together in the struggle for their freedom, their views on improving the lives of Black Americans had little else in common. Du Bois was outspoken in his suspicion of Garvey's methods, ideas, and motives. The animosity between the two men became personal and venomous. Du Bois even called Garvey the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race. He's either a lunatic or a traitor. Garvey was also criticized for his willingness to endorse individuals or groups who supported his idea of racial separation, even endorsing groups like the Ku Klux Klan. By 1919, Garvey's work had also reached the attention of the federal government. His activities were viewed as militant and dangerous to the status quo. The FBI began an investigation into Garvey and the UNIA with the goal of finding legal grounds upon which to deport him from the United States as an undesirable alien. In 1923, he and several associates were charged with mail fraud related to the sale of stock in the Black Star Line. The jury acquitted everyone but Garvey, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. When he first began serving his prison sentence at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, he wrote his First Message to the Negroes of the World from Atlanta Prison, where he made his famous proclamation, "Look for me in the whirlwind or the storm. Look for me all around you, for with God's grace I shall come and bring with me countless millions of black slaves who have died in America and the West Indies and the millions in Africa to aid you in the fight for liberty, freedom, and life." In 1927, President Calvin Coolidge pardoned Garvey on the condition he be deported back to Jamaica. During this era, a number of differing visions competed with Garvey's, including the views of Booker T. Washington and W.e.b. Du Bois, although Garvey's views were far more radical than either of them. Booker T. Washington, founder of the Tuskegee Institute, had died in 1915, but his ideas still held great power. Washington believed that African Americans should first begin by working hard and growing their industrial and farming skills to achieve economic security and forming a prosperous black community. He argued that by temporarily abandoning efforts to win civil rights and political power, and instead working to become financially prosperous, their acquisition of wealth would help them to gain the respect and acceptance of the white community. In the end, he believed this respect by whites would lead to equal rights and political power for African Americans. Others disagreed with this approach, saying that social equality and political rights must come first, not last. W.e.b. Du Bois led this criticism. Du Bois was the first African American to earn degrees from Harvard. During his lifetime, he authored 20 books and played a role in creating the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. For over 20 years, he also served as the editor of the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis. Du Bois fought a public crusade against Washington's strategy for improving the lives of African Americans. Du Bois disagreed with Washington's emphasis on vocational training for blacks over a higher education. He also argued that Washington had his priorities in the wrong order by telling blacks they should suspend work towards civil rights and instead focus on first becoming economically independent in the hopes that social equality would follow. Du Bois argued that social equality and political rights must come first, not last, to improve the lives of African Americans. He believed social change could only come through agitation and protest, and that ensuring the right to vote and winning social equality must come first. He argued that Washington's approach would only continue the oppression of blacks in America. Instead, Du Bois wanted to bold leaders to challenge segregation and discrimination through political action to bring it to an end as quickly as possible. Another movement that received nationwide recognition in the 1920s was that of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a belief based on traditional, strict, and more literal rather than figurative or metaphorical interpretations of religious texts, and is most commonly associated with certain segments of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. During the 1920s, fundamentalism rose up as a reaction against the many changes that were taking place in society, like the rise of flapper culture, organized crime, and the open and flagrant disregard of prohibition by so many citizens across the nation. Fundamentalists believed these changes were turning society into one that celebrated loose morals and low character. Former Secretary of State, three-time presidential candidate, and Presbyterian layman William Jennings Bryan turned the fundamentalist movement into a popular crusade during the 1920s. Bryan, like other Christian fundamentalists, believed in the literal interpretation of the Bible, and also believed that Charles Darwin's biological theories of evolution were not compatible or consistent with biblical scripture. In an attempt to stop the teaching of evolution in public schools, Bryan and other fundamentalists worked to present anti-evolution bills in the legislatures of 11 states, mostly in the South. In 1925, Tennessee's state legislature passed a bill outlawing the teaching of evolution in public schools and colleges. The American Civil Liberties Union, known as the ACLU, wanted to create a test case to challenge this new bill. The ACLU convinced a 24-year-old part-time high school science teacher to get involved. That teacher was John T. Scopes, and he was charged with illegally teaching evolution to his class. The trial against John Scopes began in July 1925 and would last 12 days. The trial, despite its location in Dayton, Tennessee, a small town of less than 2,000 people, quickly became the focus of worldwide attention. The streets filled with evangelists, curiosity seekers, and hundreds of reporters. Defending John Scopes was the nation's most famous trial lawyer, Clarence Darrow. William Jennings Bryan offered his services to the prosecution and became the assistant prosecuting attorney. What soon came to be known as the Monkey Trial included heated exchanges between Darrow and Bryan, especially when Darrow called Bryan to the witness stand as an expert witness on biblical interpretation. Bryan struggled to answer Darrow's questions, and his testimony revealed his ignorance of biblical theory and scholarship, thus not helping him to effectively defend his view of the Bible. At one point, the two almost came to blows, and the judge ended the trial the next day. The judge ruled that the only issue before the court was whether John Scopes had taught evolution, and no one had denied that he had. Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, but his conviction was later overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court, stating that the fine had been excessive. 5 days after the trial ended, Bryan died of a heart condition. Although the Scopes trial is often cited as discrediting the fundamentalist movement, during the years immediately following the trial, Mississippi, Texas, and other mostly southern states passed laws to bar the teaching of evolution. The ban against teaching evolution in Tennessee was not repealed, or in other words withdrawn, until 1967.